So I finally caught up on Berserk, and the only thing I can really say is that I understand the hype. I started reading the series with a bias already against it. I was 100% already expecting to not like it, and it disproved me in every single way. But I've already talked about how I used to hate Berserk, so I'm going to take a different approach here. This is going to be just an overview, just my overall thoughts of the series. I won't be too analytical or go too in depth because I can always save something like that for the future. But I think the best way to talk about my overall thoughts on the series is just to go from arc to arc. I also want to briefly talk about how the series tackles darker themes and how I think the story will progress in the future. But up first is the Black Swordsman Arc. Now, this is an arc that I don't really like, I don't think it's good, and I don't really find it entertaining. I do of course understand why it's here. It is necessary to the story, but I do think its execution is bare minimum. The art is definitely at its worst here, and that's to be expected. The character writing, I just don't find any of the characters enjoyable, and how this arc's plot ties into the overarching narrative just doesn't seem that important, especially on your first read through. This video is going to be mostly positive, but I just needed to start out with this negative here. But despite everything I said, this arc is really good in retrospect, and it's a lot better during your second read through. As everyone knows, Berserk doesn't really start hitting its strides until the Golden Age arc, and while it is amazing, I don't really think it's even close to the best arc in the series. It has more flaws and glaring flaws than either of the other two arcs, which I would consider better. Of course, in this arc we take a step back, at least in the first half we take a step back from the whole fantastical elements, and it kind of changes to where it feels more like historical fiction. But of course we do always see hints of these fantastical elements through Zod and later on the Skull Knight. And while I do like the first half of this arc, I do find it a little bit less interesting than the second half, and that's of course because the second half just has so much going for it. I mean, the first half is more about large-scale warfare, and the second half it's more of a political struggle between Griffith and a lot of the people within the kingdom, and of course Guts is being used by Griffith to do a lot of the darker shit, to be some sort of assassin. And of course at the end of the arc we have the eclipse, in which we see one of the biggest betrayals in fiction period. But while I've given this arc so many compliments, I'm gonna take time to complain a bit. I really don't like Wyald, the little mini arc that he has, and the assassins before him. I do think they mess up the pacing just a bit. In this aspect I really like the movies because they cut them out. But my biggest problem with Wyald is not how he messes up the pacing, it's that I think that he's one of the only times within the whole manga that I think the darker tones are handled poorly. And then there's the whole fact that I think his character is redundant. He's just a great value Zod. I honestly don't know the purpose he's supposed to play in this little mini arc and its greater effect on the story. And then there's the case of Koska. Now Koska is an amazing character, I don't want any of that to get confused. But of course this is where the mind break happens, and I think that just leaves so much untapped potential with her character, and that's something I'm kind of fine with because of how it sets up future arcs. But with how she's utilized in this arc alone, I mean there's 6 attempted grapes without the G on her in just this arc. Now here the situation differs a bit from Wyald, because I don't really think it's handled poorly with her, I just think it's too redundant, kind of like Wyald's character. That type of stuff happening does make sense within the story, and it's probably executed really well a couple of the times out of those 6, but there's so many times, not just in this arc but throughout the manga, where it happens and it's not really needed. If anything, while it's not done necessarily poorly, it does kind of numb the feeling towards that type of stuff. Basically, when something does happen like that where it's supposed to have a lot of narrative importance, it doesn't really have it, because by that time the reader's desensitized to the whole situation. Now the conviction arc is going to be something I'm not really going to talk about all that much, and that's just because it's without a doubt the best arc in my opinion. I mean, I'm pretty sure the horse panel does happen within this arc, and outside of that I think that the darker tones of this story are perfected in this arc. The narrative structure and character building are the best that this series has to offer. The only thing that the Golden Age arc does better than the conviction arc is the climax of the story, and even then I like this arc's climax almost just as much, and it sets up the start of the Falcon of the Millennium Empire arc so well. And I'm gonna call it the Millennium Millennium Falcon arc just to keep it short, but out of every arc in Berserk, this has the strongest start, and that's of course the conversation between Guts and Griffith. This specific conversation does so much for both characters. It shows how much Guts is matured, and it reiterates Griffith's true motive. I think this specific chapter plays such a huge part in why they're probably the most famous protagonist and antagonist duo, at least when it comes to the manga community. Now, the Millennium Falcon arc comes in second place for me, right behind the Conviction arc, and for me it's kind of a slow read. A lot of the exposition and the Griffith chapters make the pacing feel really slow at times, but all of that is easily forgiven because this arc has some of the most insane moments with some of the best panels. This arc just has so many panels that are etched into my memory that I really just can't forget. I mean, I've been seeing so many of these art pieces on the internet for so many years, wondering what the context behind them was, and now I finally know. Guts riding Zod and the Skull Knight about to stab Griffith in the back. I finally know the context behind some of the most famous panels coming from Berserk. But while I love the insane moments, that's not all this arc was. Of course, the best thing that I haven't mentioned yet is Shirkei. She is easily the best character outside of Guts, Griffith, maybe Koska, but I think she's easily third or fourth place. While I do think the Conviction arc is better, I can definitely see myself reading this arc more than any other arc in the series. The lighter tone of this arc parallels so well with Guts' development as a character. The only thing really holding this arc back is the exposition. I'd be fine with it if a lot of it felt more meaningful. A lot of it's to explain a magic system I'm not really that interested in. Now, the Fantasia arc is a little bit different because I really like the Griffith chapters a lot, and I didn't really like them in the previous arc up until the very end, and that's 100% due to Rickard. I knew that he was going to slap Griffith because I've seen the out of context panel, but I really wanted to see how things were going to get there. But while this was going on, we had the Sea God mini arc, and I just wasn't really a fan of that at all. It felt like filler. Aside from another appearance of the Moonlight Boy, I can't really think of anything significant during this arc. But eventually they got to Elfhelm, and this is when Guts' part of the story really started to pick up for me. And that's of course because we get Koska's mind healed. And that's not all. I feel like we finally started to get back to how it felt during the Millennium Falcon arc. It really started to improve on what we saw there with all the characters. While I do think some characters have stalemated, like Isidro and of course Serpico, at least now they feel like they're starting to have some good chemistry again, because I felt during that little Sea God mini arc the chemistry just felt kind of off to me. I mean, except for Shirkei and Guts, because their chemistry always on point, their characters are always hitting. But of course, Koska's mind being healed is the best thing this arc has going for it, and I'm just overall really excited for what the future of Berserk holds. Now, while I'm really interested to see how the story concludes, there's obviously the glaring fact of hiatus. Personally, I don't think the story should continue for much longer, and as an ending for the series, the only things I really want to see are Guts and Koska getting the brands removed. Now, I know that there's almost endless theories out there, but I don't think either Guts or Griffith are going to die. And I do think that if Miura decided he wanted to do either of those, that it would be extremely hard to execute. In the case of Guts dying, I don't see how that would ever benefit his character arc or the overarching narrative of the series. And the same really goes for Griffith. I don't think that helps out Griffith as an antagonist or Guts as a protagonist. While I don't think forgiveness is a theme within this series at all, I do think moving past revenge is. And I've seen a lot of talk of Koska dying and that kind of reigniting the flame of revenge within Guts, and I also don't see that benefiting any of the themes within the story at all. And I can see why there's so many theories on the ending of Berserk, because it's so open-ended. It could end so many different ways. I'm also not that big of a theorist either. Now, I did say I was going to talk about darker tones and how they affect the overall story of Berserk, but I think I've already done that just talking about the different arcs. But to sum it all up, I think that Berserk does a phenomenal job with its darker tones most of the time. Depending on the situation that you're talking about, the execution of said darker tone can range anywhere from phenomenal to mediocre to bad. Just to give examples, what happened to Koska during the eclipse is phenomenal. Obviously, it's a terrible thing, but it was executed really well. Then in mediocre, you have something like the trolls, how they need human women in order to reproduce. It just really feels like some edgy Goblin Slayer type shit. And then the stuff that is not executed well at all, you could call it horrendous if you want to. You have stuff like the infamous horse panel and all the stuff with Wyald. But yeah, that's gonna be pretty much it. Tell me what you guys think of the video and or Berserk in the comments below. I used to hate it, now it's within my top 3.